Hi guys, and welcome to our channel. My name's Imad and I'm a tutor at Study Buddies. We are an established education centre based in East London, providing quality after-school tuition to children ages 6 to 18, from primary school through to A-levels. We specialise in maths, English, sciences and 11 plus tutoring, providing small group and one-to-one classes from just £6.50 an hour. If you'd like to know more about us, then please visit our website at www.studybuddies.co.uk. You'll find our details on the screen. So today we're going to be looking at narrative as our first video on literary techniques. Now when we use the term narrative, it usually describes the perspective of the speaker in the text. The speaker in a novel is called the narrator, and the speaker in a poem is called the voice. Now in both cases, they'll be going through the events of a certain text, and they'll be describing thoughts and feelings of characters. Narrative generally comes in three different forms, and these are three perspectives from which a narrator or a speaker can talk about events in the text. You might be familiar with first, second, and third person, but just in case you aren't, let's go through them. So the first person is when the narrator is talking from their own point of view about themselves. They'll be constantly using terms like I and we to describe their place in the text. The second person is when the narrator is talking to the reader. So they'll be referring to us in the text, saying, you might notice, or you need to understand. This is quite a dramatic way of speaking, and you'll rarely find it in texts. Third person is when the narrator is speaking externally, talking from outside the text about events happening in the text. The narrator in third person never refers to themselves. They'll be talking about the characters and the events that are transpiring in the text. When it comes to exams, narrative can be really useful in looking at literary techniques. You might find that when you come to a text, especially one that you haven't seen before, that you'll struggle to find specific sentences to do with alliteration, simile, or metaphor. Because these aren't always used in texts, they can make it hard for you when you've just started looking at a text. Often they can waste valuable time at the start of an exam. Narrative, however, is present in every single text. So straight from the beginning, you can start talking about narrative and you'll be ready with some points for literary techniques. The second point to remember is that there's no standard narrative style. That means that every writer makes a specific choice when it comes to narrative. If they're speaking in first, second, or third person, they make that choice. And it's up to us as readers to explain why they make that choice and what effect that has on the rest of the text. If you struggle to talk about narrative in an exam, you can focus on where the narrative might change. Even though some texts are written in third person, you can find that they switch to first person at times. So the narrator is talking about all the rest of the characters, but they might briefly mention themselves as well. It's useful to look at where narrative or literary texts in general might change or where they stand out to you. Things that you find interesting are generally good starting places to talk about literary techniques or about the text. So we've looked at first, second, and third person, but when we're talking about narrative in a text, it can be quite useful to look a bit deeper into the way a narrative is used. When I say this, I mean that different writers use first person in different ways. It's not as if the first person is a standard register which is completely equal in different texts. Let's go through some common narrative forms in first, second, and third person, so you might see what I mean. In some first-person narratives, the narrator can form quite a close connection with the reader. This is because they're talking from their own perspective, so they can describe all their own thoughts and feelings, as well as those of other characters. In some cases, narrators are written by writers to be very emotional or very changeable. And this means that our whole perception of the story they're telling can be skewed or flawed. This is called the unreliable narrator. When you're looking at texts like Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde, it can be quite useful to consider the narrator's own motives and their own emotions when they're talking about a whole story. You might even find that in some texts, the writer uses multiple first-person narrators to make up the story. Each of these narrators will have their own personal opinions and they'll be speaking about different events in the text. Because they have their own views and they're affected by their emotions, the readers have to piece together the story and judge how reliable a narrator might be when they're talking about the story. When multiple first-person narrators give different accounts or different shreds of information about the overall story, this is called an epistolary narrative. The second person is quite a rare register, as we've mentioned, but also a very useful dramatic technique. Because we as readers usually expect the text to be recited to us, either talking about other characters and their lives, or the narrator and their lives, we rarely expect to be brought directly into the text. When the narrator uses the term you, we suddenly become part of the text. Third-person narrative can have quite a lot of variety across different texts. You might find that in some of the books you've read, the narrator is completely withdrawn from the events of the text. They're external from these matters, but they have a complete knowledge of the working of characters' minds and the events that are happening in different places at different times. This effect can mean that the narrator chooses to share some pieces of information with the reader that characters don't know about, and this effect is called dramatic irony. One thing you might note is that literary techniques are often used together and they're intertwined. When a writer chooses a certain narrative form, it allows certain literary techniques to be easier for them. So as we've mentioned, dramatic irony, which is when the readers know something that the characters don't, is useful when the third-person narrator knows everything that's going on with the text, so they can share some of that information with us. However, this isn't always the case, and the third-person narrator can also be quite limited in information. They could be viewing characters from the outside and not knowing what's going on inside their own minds or in how they're feeling. This is quite a rare technique, and it's quite an abstract form of writing, but you might find it in few of the books that you read. I've gone through these different uses of narrative to show you that first, second, and third person aren't all there is to writing a story. At the same time, the points I've listed aren't all there is to narrating a story, and as a result, I think it's best to read through your whole text and make a judgment on the narrative for yourself. When you come to this understanding, you'll have points already there when you start writing your exam. So now that we've learned about narrative and how it can be used, let's try and apply what we've learned to a text. This one's from Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of the Four. In this extract, the detective Sherlock Holmes is looking at a crime scene and deciphering clues from it. His assistant, the narrator, Watson, is taking a look at him decipher all these clues, and he's describing what he sees. The extract reads as follows. He whipped out his lens and a tape measure and hurried along the room on his knees, measuring, comparing, examining, with his long, thin nose only an inch from the planks, and his beady eyes gleaming and deep-set like those of a bird. So silent, swift, and furtive were his movements, like those of a trained bloodhound picking out a scent, that I could not help but think what a terrible criminal he would have made, had he turned his energy and sagacity against the law, instead of exerting them in its defence. As he hurried around, he kept muttering to himself, and finally broke out in a loud crow of delight. You might want to take a second to pause this video, and perhaps make a few deductions about the text for yourself. Remember to keep an eye on the narrative, but feel free to look at other literary techniques as well. So now let's take a look at my annotations of narrative in the text. As you can see where it's highlighted in purple, the third person starts off this extract, and generally third person is used by Watson throughout the book. However, you see that he sometimes makes interjections in the first person. He goes from describing things around him and Sherlock's behaviour to personal opinions from his own point of view. As you can see where it's highlighted in green, he says, "I could not help but think what a terrible criminal he would have made." This is his own personal opinion about how good a criminal Sherlock could be if he decided to work against the law instead of for the law. This is quite useful to us because even though Watson takes the position of the third-person narrator, but we're trusting him to relay accurately the events of the book, we find that the text is infused with his own personal opinions, as well as poetic language and simile, as you can see in the blue highlight. This means that we can only trust his narrative to a limited extent. Some literary critics argue that Sherlock Holmes is made into a hero through Watson's narrative. Watson's a close friend of Sherlock, and he's very impressed by his skills. But as a result, we might question how far this means his narrative is flawed and less accurate than it could be. As I've mentioned, Watson's using poetic language, for example, his beady eyes gleaming and deep-set like those of a bird. Now, while this might be true, that he has beady eyes, the fact that he's likening him to a bird using simile shows that Watson is using a poetic form of language, which is supposedly a less accurate means of communication. Watson sees Sherlock as something beyond human, which is why he's constantly using similes and metaphors to do with animals. From this brief passage, we can begin to undermine the reliability of a narrative simply by looking at transitions in the narrative form and the way simile can be used along with narrative. As we go through this series, I hope you'll be able to pick out more literary techniques and how they're used together to create certain effects in text. This can be really useful in exams because when you're making one point, you can be talking about 3 different literary techniques, and this is much more impressive to the examiner when you show them how the techniques are linked together to create certain common effects. So that's the end of today's video. Next week we'll be looking at tenses and the distortion of time, which is another technique which you can find throughout the whole text, rather than just in specific sentences. If you like this video and want to see more like this, please hit that like button and feel free to subscribe to our channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.